Surely it is no accident that the study of history has been the solace of many of the noblest minds of every generation. Henry Steele Commanger, who was born in 1902, taught history at New York University, Columbia, and Amherst College. We should be denied some of those intellectual and moral experiences which give meaning and richness to life. Surely it is no accident that the study of history has been the solace of many of the noblest minds of every generation. Henry Steele Commanger, who was born in 1902, taught history at New York University, Columbia, and Amherst College, an author of more than 40 books. He was a public scholar and an intellectual. Neil Drummondville writes, a scholar should be a generalist. In this view, an exhorter as well as an interpreter. No less than a preacher, a historian should address the moral principles of life, the necessary commitments to justice and equality and opportunity, the responsibility that the powerful owe to the weak. The historian's badge was not a license to retreat to the archive away from the pain of the world. Instead, it was an obligation to join in current debates and to propose solutions that might be divined from the experience of history. To me, that's what's most fascinating about Commanger, about how he was a public intellectual and a public scholar. It was not the information, but what you did with the information that counted. And I'll read you one more quote from one of his later essays on education, the fundamental American institution. There is no more encouraging, no more impressive example of resourcefulness in response to need than the community college, an institution which in a single generation has taken a place equal to that of the free public school and the university in our education hierarchy. By training a whole generation of the young to the skills necessary for complex technological and administrative economy, and at the same time providing opportunities unequaled elsewhere in the world for cultural enrichment and training in civic duties and responsibilities that the ever-growing body of what we euphemistically call senior citizens, the community college represents a kind of triumph for democratic education, for it avoids the class stigma of the two or the multi-track education system of older class societies. How wonderful to be able to tie those two things together here for this lecture series. And to carry on those values, today we have the pleasure of Madeleine Blaise. Madeleine Blaise is a professor of journalism at the university at UMass Amherst. Before coming to the university, she worked as a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter for Tropic Magazine of the Miami Herald, the Boston Globe, the Washington Post, New York Times, among others. Early in her career, Ms. Blaise went on a visit to Key West to interview Tennessee Williams, and the island soon became one of her favorite places in the world. She's an author of a collection of essays called The Heart is an Instrument, In These Girls, Hope is a Muscle, a book about the championship season of a girls' basketball team from Amherst. This book was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award in the category of nonfiction and was named as one of the top 100 sports books ever written by ESPN. And there are only 3 women writers among there. Her most recent book is Uphill Walkers, Biography of a Family. I had Maddie as a teacher when I was in graduate school, and it was one of the most fascinating experiences because it was a mixed class. It was a class of graduate students and undergraduate students, and we all shared the roles of teaching and learning. And one of the things that I took most powerfully from that class was, how do you learn from the stories that you tell? Memoir is all about the personal experience, but the audience for a memoir is like the audience for a newspaper. How do you extrapolate? How do you learn? How do you interface with the bigger world out of one story, one experience? And out of all the gifts she gave that semester, that was perhaps the largest for me. So let's give a hand to welcome Maddie Blaze.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. It's an honor to be at GCC, a school that has sent us at UMass some of our finest students. It's an honor to be giving an address named after such a prominent historian whose views about the democratizing of history mirror my own, fortunately. And also especially to be introduced by my former student, Leo. Back in the day, he had a really long ponytail and wore jeans all the time. So, you know, we live in a world where it often seems there isn't much good news, but I think it's really good news when someone you used to teach gets to have a fancy title, be a dean, and look so styling. So, you know, we're not exactly, okay. I've prepared my speech for today, my talk, and I will try to talk it as much as possible rather than just read. And I may end up skipping some pages at a certain point because I know that at least a few of you will be likely to have questions. The talk that I have prepared is basically geared towards all ages, as they say in music venues. To people who are young students, perhaps I'm going to be talking a lot about what it's like to teach undergraduates memoir, but everything that I say to an undergraduate applies to anybody at any point in their lives. So let's begin. In years past, memoir was dismissed, often unfairly, as a marginal genre. It was practiced by often ineffectual has-beens, retired military officers mulling past glories, and wistful worshipers of some tiny corner of their own often privileged past. But memoir has changed. It has gone from wallflower to vamp. You only have to look at the bestseller list to know what I mean by vamp. It has nudged, some might say bullied, others waltzed its way into mainstream literature, not to mention bestseller lists. You would have to be as introverted as a snail on sedatives not to have noticed this trend in the past 20 years towards eyewitness stories and personal testimony. And I have been, for better or for worse, a cheerleader of this, not only because I wrote a memoir, but also because I'm an avid consumer of them, and I've been teaching a course in memoir writing at the university since 1987. Everyone requires an opiate or two to keep the dogs far hence, to keep the dread at bay, an organizing principle. For some people, it's golf, waterfront property, faith in the healing power of a large income, trout, romance, whiskey, vehicular vanity, bingo, Jesus, The Sopranos, bonus miles, free minutes, string instruments, or old school ties. My opiate is memoir. I used to feel defensive, especially when I was working on my book. A book about growing up in a family in Western Massachusetts, in a family that was which today would be trendily called a single-parent home, but back then was just a matter of bad luck. Just what the world needs, I would sigh, another memoir. But now I feel less of an urge to apologize. It strikes me that there are all kinds of ways in which people construct meaning, and storytelling is one of the better ones. So despite a glut of titles, despite a cheapening of the currency, despite memoirs that are at heart failed fiction, or craven acts of literary soul-stealing, or in some other way dishonest at their core, the form remains popular. So much so that not long ago, the New York Times published an article declaring that memoir had outstripped fiction in both advances from publishers and frequency of publication. For me, the appeal began well before its present regard and persists today despite its least attractive manifestations. Like every writer I have ever heard of, I began my career as a reader, and that was partly a matter of wonderful chance in the town where I grew up, Granby, Massachusetts. I lived literally across the street from the public library, and it wasn't even a main thoroughfare, so I could cross over that street from an early age without we lived very close to also to Route 202, and that was much more daunting. The town I grew up in, I always say, could have been the Midwest in the way it reveled in the ordinariness of its rhythms. We had horses as pets, homemade rhubarb pie to eat. We had a Grange fair. There was a certain kind of aura of penny-pinching republicanism that were very familiar to me. As Irish Catholics, my family ate fish on Fridays. We made the sign of the cross with what must have been interpreted as disconcerting frequency. We were the edgy newcomers, the gypsies, the artists, the bohemians, the supporters of Adlai Stevenson. In short, we were the dark and mysterious other. We valued language even more than tools, and we had an air of eccentricity, partly inspired by my father's early death, trailed as we were by the unspoken question, how do they manage after all? The library across the street was, of course, one of the ways in which we managed. And the librarians took to saving books for me that they thought that I would like. And I actually became addicted not to libraries, but actually to new books. So now bookstores are the beneficiary of all this, because I always buy new hardbacks. But at any rate, these librarians knew a fellow reader when they saw one, and they were always saying to me, here, you might like this. And it was one day when they said to me, and I was in the 8th grade, here, you might like this, that they gave me a copy of the Diary of Anne Frank. Now, narcissism may be the bane of youth, but it is also its saving grace. Anne, who I referred to by her first name, she was my new friend, lived and died before I was born in a place I had never seen under circumstances I could barely envision. Yet, when you are a teenager and absolutely uncertain of where you fit into the planet, you might as well go for broke and place yourself at the dead center of the turning world. The parallels between Anne Frank and my own life floored me. Her irritating family could have been my irritating family precisely. Now, I understand from the news yesterday that one of President Bush's daughters is writing a book about someone in Panama. There's going to be 500,000 copies printed, and she thinks it's going to replace Anne Frank. Those are fighting words, as far as I'm concerned. Not much later, the next memoir I remember reading was when I went to high school. There was a book that was popular for a while. It got quite a bit of extensive press back in the day. It was by a man named Claude Brown, and it was called Man-Child in the Promised Land. It was a coming-of-age story by a black man who grew up in Harlem, and his world was also one that was about as far away as I could imagine. He would describe holdups and drug deals, and I worried about my 4-H project in animal husbandry, which basically I take to be, now that I've gotten much older, 4-H is sort of dedicated to beauty pageants for rabbits, and that's what that was. So here you have that life and trying to read about these holdups and drug deals, et cetera. Nonetheless, thanks to memoir, I found out about it. Later, when I went to Ursuline Academy on Plumtree Row in Springfield, Massachusetts, I found out about Mary McCarthy's Memories of a Catholic Girlhood. And I remember inserting that book into my geometry text so I could read about the daring, the secular, the clever, the cold-hearted Mary and all her scheming relations, while my geometry teacher nattered on about the differences between trapezoids and parallelograms. Behind our teacher's back, we used to translate her name from the Latin and refer to her. Her name was Mother Immaculata, during moments of daring as Sister Spotless, or even more risky, Sister Dirt-Free. Mother Immaculata discovered my subterfuge. She gave me a sad, resigned look. She shook her head. She leaned over. She put her head close to mine. Her lightweight, rimless glasses slid down her nose. She smelled of talc and sanctity, and she hissed, "I hope you don't grow up to be like her, to be someone spiteful, someone who," dramatic pause, "likes to spill the beans." Of course, when you get an order that explicit and that stifling at a formative age, it's only a matter of time before you do just the opposite. Self-serving in nature, memoirs are at their best, paradoxically, when they are the least self-promoting. The decade of the 70s fluctuated, as some of us in the room will remember, between bad taste and bad events. It gave us leisure suits, Charlie's Angels, sideburns, Studio 54, 4.5-inch wide ties, and even wider lapels. It gave us Starsky and Hutch, Mork and Mindy, Martha Mitchell, Patty Hearst, the Symbionese Liberation Army, Watergate, airplane hijackings, national malaise, sky-high interest rates, Son of Sam, inane songs about tiptoeing through the tulips. Yet it was a decade that rewarded hardcore memoir devotees with some excellent work, such as A Fan's Notes by Frederick Exley, The Duke of Deception by Jeffrey Wolfe, Stop Time by Frank Conroy, Facts of Life by Maureen Howard, Something of significance was happening in the culture that allowed an individual life story to be told without the mitigating veil of fiction. At that point, memoirs weren't displacing novels as the bearers of the real news, but they were clamoring for equal time on the shelf. As a collector of apt quotes, I want to cite one that made its way into every notebook I kept during college. And it's something that William Butler Yeats said, and he was defending introspection as a valorous activity, even a dangerous one. And he said, "A man can show no more reckless courage than it takes to enter the abyss of the self." And so, in that spirit of reckless courage, semester after semester, a small group of self-selected students embark on that most perilous of journeys, with me as their teacher, acting as the guide. I am often asked about teaching traditional-age undergraduates if they aren't too young for that kind of self-scrutiny. People say nothing has happened to them yet. What on earth do college students have to write about? The answer is actually plenty. I'm going to quote something that I read in a memoir. The memoir is My Sky Blue Trades, and it's by a man named Sven Burkest, and he was quoting the wonderful, wonderful writer Flannery O'Connor. And he makes this remark. He said, "Flannery O'Connor once observed that for most writers, everything of importance happens before the end of adolescence. Provocative, almost preposterous, the insight begins to make more sense as we reflect upon it. O'Connor does not mean that these writers in the making will have had by that time most of their life experiences, certainly not. What she means is that the writer, almost by definition, observant and questioning, will have extrapolated from whatever has befallen him a set of intuitions about the basic laws of human nature. He will be far along in the formulation of the chrysalis, the sheath, that most delicate binding structure of language and perception out of which the mature artist eventually emerges. And no matter what the writer later ventures and achieves, his work will always be imprinted with the strong taste of origins." My memoir class has lots of rituals, such as the midterm mission of mercy, taking the form of bagels and cream cheese. But perhaps none is more important than the speech I make on the first day of class. And that's the time when I get to say things that I wouldn't feel as comfortable saying as the semester progressed. It's the time when you're laying down the law. And I think every teacher in this room knows that feeling, and the students in this room also know that feeling, perhaps from different sides of the equation. But in the first class, I explained that during the first half of the semester, we'll be doing a lot of heavy lifting in the form of reading. Back to the old thought, you can't become a writer unless you've also been a reader. And the point, of course, is for people to read very carefully, to read the way writers do, and create their own set of standards. And books that I use time in and time out include books like Hemingway's A Movable Feast, Tobias Wolff's This Boy's Life. Recently, I've used Joan Didion's In the Year of Magical Thinking. And just whatever, the books vary. I refresh the stock from semester to semester, but there are some core books there. I also tell the students that as for their final paper, I have a few rules. Just as it takes the bones of dinosaurs a century to fossilize into coal for fuel, it takes a long time for the experience in your life to become tempered with perspective. So generally, I tell the students, I want you to avoid the breaking news in your lives. No profiles of roommates, no matter how interesting or eccentric or irritating they are. No profiles of current boyfriends or of current girlfriends, I don't care which you have. No stories about how someone got drunk every weekend of his freshman year or his sophomore year. And then if the class looks particularly sleepy, I do add, or junior year or senior year. No bulimia, no anorexia, no cutting, no, you get the point. The reason being that I have found that writing about addiction, no matter how troubling or how influential it has been in your life, inevitably maintains your relationship with it. I am more interested in having you, the young student, capture some sense of yourself as a whole person rather than to focus on one disabled aspect. It is not so much that I oppose certain topics in and of themselves, but actually that I don't want them to be the centerpiece. This is particularly relevant with young people. It's not the same with older people who have more perspective. But if you don't, and if someone's just trying to write about their relation, some part of themselves that really they need a lot more, they're in the midst of, it's almost better to ask them to write about something different. I do say to the students that it isn't therapy, that it's 4 credits in the journalism department. I urge them when they write to avoid diagnostic categories. Fine memoir writers are forever describing things like substance abuse, peer parenting, abandonment, you name it. Yet, all manner of upheaval, and yet they never use deadening jargon. The goals of therapy and of writing are different, even though the territory is often the same. One tends to lead to self-acceptance, the other to art, and only possibly as a happy add-on, like shrimp on your Caesar salad, to self-acceptance. Therapy might make you a better person, but not necessarily a better writer. The best memoirs are offered in the spirit that might be called post-therapy, after what one reviewer called the rage, the indignation, the feverish peak, and the self-absorption have subsided, and what is left is the one true story. I tell the students, and I tell this to myself when I write as well, I have nothing against getting even as a motive. If your teacher in the 2nd grade really did make you sit in a wastebasket, you have every right to give your version of why this was unfair, no matter how belatedly. If your father made you copy out an entire textbook word for word because you flunked a science test in junior high, his edict deserves to be documented. Memoirs are often nothing more than the talk shows in your head, tamed. They're elegant tantrums without, ideally, the finger-pointing and the head-banging and the shouting. They are always a dish best served cold. A student once wrote about her 7 weeks at a fat camp at Brandeis University, where the only unlimited food was sugar-free Jell-O. This was, I assure you, a revenge narrative. In class, we talk about the form itself, how it is endearingly democratic, how anyone can write a memoir, not that everyone should, but almost anyone could. Generals write autobiographies. They write public events of public people in public places. Foot soldiers write memoirs. I have heard the difference between a memoir and an autobiography described as the difference between a painting and a photograph. In memoir, the world of external affairs is seen through the eyes of someone who, if not precisely powerless, is usually not at the center of the action. History, in the official sense, involving wars and treaties, popes and monarchs, conquest and plunder, coronations, and especially if you are a woman who did not have a son, beheadings, usually stays in the background of memoirs. History is subdued and put at the mercy of the ordinary people who experience it. The clomping boots and the bastion doors of World War II in Italy haunt Natalia Ginsburg's The Things We Used to Say. But what matters most is how the big, bold themes played out in one extended family. The whole of life, not in the deluge, but in a drop of rain. It can be argued that the popularity of this form in recent times represents a democratization of narrative, an expansion of the roster of the kinds of people who are encouraged to tell their stories, and even an opening up of the nature of the stories themselves. Katharine Graham's personal history is a great exception to all of this because it is both an autobiography and a memoir, because the author is both a general and a foot soldier. She was on the one hand the publisher of the Washington Post during Watergate. On the other, she was a widowed mother of 4 children. Her husband committed suicide after a long struggle with mental illness. And that mental illness took the form of many hurtful acts leading up to the suicide. Like many of the best memoirs, personal history has an air of detached dignity, as if she is beyond currying favor or proving points. She sacrifices the latest dish for the long view. Her audience appears not to be her children or even her grandchildren, but descendants not yet born who might want to know what it was like when their great-great-great-grandmother was running the world. Other writers, as well, regard their memoirs as a form of legacy. Recently, I picked up Calvin Trillin's beautiful, elegiac little book about his wife after Alice, who died of lung cancer, probably the result of growing up in a house filled with secondhand smoking. She died on 9/11, but of course her death was not acknowledged very widely at the time. She died in a hospital in New York City. He wrote a book about her, and he dedicated it to his grandchildren. And they have the names of today's current crop of grandchildren, Izzy and Toby and Rebecca and Nate. Keep in mind that just because it's a memoir doesn't make it good or bad. Like any other work of art, a memoir has to earn your respect. As a writer, you do not get automatic points for having suffered or for anything else. For a while now, it has been impossible for anyone to write a favorable review of memoir without trashing the genre or lashing out at its worst practitioners, who do appear to be legion, judging from the amount of venom devoted to these mostly phantom works. Yes, there are weak links. There are books that I think do the genre a disservice. They're the books that seem to be screaming at you or screeching at you, and they seem to have as their underlying plot, top this, top this, top this. And I would consider books such as Katharine Graham's The Kiss, in which she confessed to having an affair with her father, or Michael Ryan's Secret Life, in which he acknowledged a compulsive desire to pursue a multitude of women, to be more interested in general, in shocking rather than illuminating. And obviously, James Fry's book, A Million Little Pieces, was in that category of a book that would try to just turn up the volume to this huge degree so that actually the real essential story of whatever it was that James Fry was suffering never got told in that book. Just as a little sidelight, he tries in that book to make himself seem like this badass person. And I checked, and now I'm going to forget the name of his college, but he went to a really good liberal arts college out in the Midwest. And I Googled it, and it turns out it has a 450-acre nature preserve, and it's almost always the #1 squash champion in the United States. So he didn't come from the bad streets he wanted to pretend he came from. Why he wanted to pretend he came from those bad streets, I'm not sure. See, my theory is if he'd written the real story, that would have been just as good. But so, okay, we're readers, and our time is limited. We're trying to figure out which books to read. We might be trying to read them or wanting to read them simply because we like reading memoir. We also might be thinking about writing our own. How do you know which ones are good? How do you know which ones are written by ranting egotists and revenge seekers of the lowest orders, what used to be called on the playground real crybabies, and which books are worthy of your attention? I do have a couple of rules. One is no sentimentality, especially as regards childhood. Even the most fortunate childhoods are more than lollipops and licorice, Disney World, 4th of July parades, and impromptu piggyback rides provided by sexually appropriate adults. As George Orwell, whose such were the joys, is a model of banished sentimentality, warns, anyone who writes about his childhood must beware of exaggeration or self-pity. Nor is the author ever the hero of his story. As Tobias Wolff observed, writers of all kinds are prone to self-idealization, but the best memoirists have an astonishing capacity for seeing themselves in the round, fully implicated in the fallen creation of which they write. And when his student and protege, Mary Karr, was writing The Liars Club, he sent her a note warning her to take no care for your, he said, take no care for your dignity. Don't be afraid of appearing angry, small-minded, obtuse, mean, immoral, amoral, calculating, or anything else. And to her credit, she wasn't. One of my favorite scenes in The Liars Club occurs during a car ride to the beach, during which time the author torments her legless grandma. Karr is not alone in shining a negative spotlight on her life. Frederick Exley acknowledges that his sexual initiation was thanks to a girl who, quote, received with neither complaint nor enthusiasm a good part of Watertown High School's 1945 football team. Lucy Greeley admits to stealing greeting cards from the gift shops in the hospitals where she was a frequent patient due to surgeries for cancer, which eventually left her disfigured. John Weidman confesses a fondness for the strip joints in downtown Springfield, especially a place called Mardi Gras. John Carroll, the author of An American Requiem, tells his readers about spilling coffee on his crotch just as he was about to be summoned on stage onto the Dick Cavett show. He quotes, numbness gave way to a feeling of nausea, and even as I heard the dutiful applause of the studio audience, I frantically wiped at my pants. I did not have coffee today before I got just water. That's just a new nightmare, for all of us. Kathy Dobie writes about how she wrote a wonderful book called The Only Girl in the Car. In years past, the only girl in the car never spoke up. She was too ashamed to tell her story. But she wrote about the boy she never should have trusted, who passed her out to his friends in the back seat of his car, who, convenient for his friends was filled with them, and they had been waiting their turn. It goes on, the misdeeds and the hard times and the moments of shame and disappointment recorded by writers of conscience as they trample through the underbrush and the briar patches of our fallen creation in search of a shiny truth or two. But what draws us readers is not so much the admission of wrongdoing or of weakness, but how the writers have stood up for or made peace with themselves in the aftermath. I tell my class that it is true that the very word memoir has a dainty, precious, scented sound, like boudoir or bonbon. And there is something admirable and old-fashioned about the leisurely exploration practiced by writers of memoir. They remind me of dance cards in the age of hookups, consomme in a time of smoothies. It is also true that most memoirs are about events that occurred in dusky venues long ago that would have remained obscure but for the author's perverse insistence to the contrary. I tell the students, and I tell you today, do not be misled. There is nothing about a good memoir that is soft or easy. It is not a genre for the faint of heart. Precisely the opposite for two reasons. The author of a memoir courts an especially invasive form of criticism. When you write a memoir, the potential for venom from the critics increases. Your work, not only is the work being reviewed, but also the quality of life led by the author. The sword can slash in two directions. If skin were biologically capable of generating its own layer, this would be the time. Also, the very material that gets documented in a memoir can often be heart-wrenching, nearly unbearable. The landscape of memoir is littered with dead babies and absent parents. But does memoir have to be about trauma? Not at all. Books such as An American Childhood by Annie Dillard, Manhattan When I Was Young by Mary Cantwell, Walker in the City by Alfred Kazan, Fierce Attachments by Vivian Gornick, Piano Lessons by Noah Adams, French Lessons by Alice Kaplan compensate with elegance for what they lack in fireworks. In general, if you're going to write a memoir, people ask me if there's any special things you can do to prepare for it. I always say, well, there are two things, if possible. To have as many siblings in your background as possible and as many nuns in your background as possible. It also helps if anybody here who studied with the nuns and had a bunch of brothers and sisters, you're halfway there. And I studied with the good nuns, I have to say that. I don't have any stories but good ones, which is probably unfortunate. If you're a writer, not if you're a human being, but they're not often always the same. It's also really helpful if you grew up in the boonies to some degree. Places like West Texas, Limerick, Ireland, Concrete, Washington, the outback of Australia have all been spoken for. But not to worry, the world is filled with places people only want to be from. Besides, you can't backorder trauma or geography any more than you can backorder happiness. The majority of writers have experienced a major before and after along the way, a strong dose of what it is like to be on the outside looking in. Ann Tyler put it this way: you have to have had rheumatic fever in your childhood. I've never had rheumatic fever, but I believe that any kind of setting apart experience will do well. For Lorene Corey, who wrote Black Ice, it was being part of a racial minority at the exclusive St. Paul's School in Concord, New Hampshire. For Helen Fremont, after long silence, it was because of sexual orientation as well as her falsified ethnic identity. For Rick Bragg, all over but the shouting, it was economic and regional disenfranchisement. In the end, you will not be judged, though, by what has happened to you in your life, but how well you wrote about it. As one critic said, it's all in the art. You get no credit for living. Childhood itself is, by definition, a marginalized state in which we are dependent on people much larger and more powerful than ourselves for our safety and well-being, people who often fall down on the job. But just because you've had it tough, just because you have a given story, a cataclysmic event in your past, does not mean you can write a shaped literary memoir. If it's such a cinch, why did it take Frank McCourt until his 60s to finally write his in a way that did the story justice? Or, to quote him, to finally find the, quote, significance in his own insignificant life. Why now, you may be asking? Why has memoir achieved such a high degree of popularity in recent times? What in the culture is encouraging writers to ransack their past with such a vengeance? The common assumption is that as other social structures have eroded, the impulse towards memoir is a step towards ordering the chaos. From governments that lie about weapons of mass destruction as a pretext for starting a war, to a pope who appeared to bait Muslims at an especially inopportune time in world history, to members of Congress who debate the fine points of torture, at the same time ignoring pornographic emails from one of their own to underage pages, to the diminished stature of the planet in general, including of the solar system in general, including demoted planets like Pluto, to the overall levels of hypocrisy, fraud, and mayhem worldwide, there is perhaps little else you can count on than your own version of what went down in your life. And although nearly everyone pays lip service to the notion that 9/11 changed America forever, if you recall the Portraits in Grief published in the New York Times in that year following that terrible series of events, you will remember that the smaller stories of individual loss created meaning in a way the larger story has yet to. In addition, personal privacy as a notion is nearly antiquated. Our lives are more or less transparent thanks to speed passes, weblogs, MySpace, YouTube, and other computer-generated billboards. The sense of inhibition and discretion of keeping things to oneself that might have silenced some memoir writers in the past no longer exists. As the social scientists love to point out, we all live in one big glass house. We are all on a party line. We are all chatting across the electronic clothesline. The rise of the memoir, then, appears to be a cry of the heart brought about in part by a matter of timing, at the end of one century, at the start of a new one, when the winds of redefinition traditionally blow. It is a way of claiming one's perch on the planet, however puny. It is a lament for the old way of being, when we reveled in the notion of the individual, the lone cowboy on the plains, silent, taciturn, staring up at a vast fixed sky, Pluto included, and a call for a new one in which we link arms figuratively across time and space to see what, if anything, we have in common. As I tell my students, voice rising, as if I'm planting a flag on a newly discovered mountain peak. I've made this point many times, but I'll make it again. Funneled through the individual, history at last achieves resonance. Finally, I offer the class one last caveat, similar to the one employed by the grade school teacher who forbids hearts and rainbows in the children's paintings. No sunsets, I tell them, no beaches, and especially no beaches at sunset. In case I seem too stern, I remind them of other teachers who affect the same rigid persona and who forbid certain words like moonlight, silhouette, tawny in student prose, and another friend of mine, a colleague at a different school, who has made a vow to never again read a single word about anyone's spring break, especially if it occurred in Cancun. That first meeting of the class, then, I offer it to you to see what you can take it from it for your own work, for yourselves, but it is a grab bag of techniques and tips and talking points about the art of memoir. In some ways, it represents the progress, what I've just told you, the progress of a semester summarized. I offer these to you in the hope that if you are thinking about writing your memoir, you can embark on your own version of this process at your own speed, keeping in mind what the critic Laurie Stone said in one of those extremely simple statements that conceals its complications. She said, the goal of memoir is not to tell your experience as a story, but to find the story in your experience. My husband's favorite work of nonfiction is a book called Young Men and Fire by Norman Maclean. He often quotes this sentence describing the naive optimism of the smoke jumpers who are the subject of the book. They were still so young, they hadn't learned to count the odds and to sense that they might owe the universe a tragedy. You may owe the universe your demise, but along the way, you also owe yourself an act of defiance or two. And if scuba diving or rock climbing or some other proven avenue of daring do does not work for you, you might consider writing a memoir, which has its own perils after all, as one way to defy the odds, at least temporarily. Thank you.
Andy Blaze has offered to answer some questions.
Yes.
What is the difference between an autobiography and a memoir? Is an autobiography just another name for the memoir and then expanded to cover
basically, the way I define it is an autobiography is written by a public person who occupies a public space and maybe even includes the whole of his life or her life, whereas a memoir is a much more of a glance, not a mural. So I think the difference is the focus. And often memoirs are written by foot soldiers rather than by generals. So that's how I look at it.
Autobiographies are intended hopefully for commercial sale as against memoir.
Well, you can't say that anymore because memoir, some memoirists are laughing all the way to the bank. So if you hit the jackpot, particularly, I mean, James Frey, it interests me that even when he was picked by Oprah, he was already at the top of the bestseller list. So, I mean, he was just, there was gold and then there are fibs. But he was certainly making a ton of money, so, yeah.
You want to talk a little bit about the phony memoirs that have, there's a number that have, in recent years, that have turned out to be just baloney.
Like what? Well,
Presented as truth.
Running with Scissors.
what, Running with Scissors?
Yeah.
Have you read that?
Yes.
What did you think?
What is it?
What did you think of Running with Scissors?
It's a work of fiction.
It's a work of fiction, you think? That Jonathan Yardley, the critic of the Washington Post, felt it was a work of fiction too. Are you familiar with that? Because that's set in the Valley. It's set in Northampton. And it's a very interesting case of a book that was written by somebody who wasn't, well, I don't think, particularly well known when it came out, but since the book has been a major bestseller, and of course it's been made into a movie starring the actress who always is over the top. Okay, Annette Bening, right? She's always doing hysterical people. I think she plays Augustin Burroughs' mother in the movie. Augustin Burroughs' real name, I believe, is Chris Robeson. That book is the subject, if you're interested, of an article in Vanity Fair that came out in December, looking at the family that the book is based on and some of their feelings about having been portrayed in this book against their will, and ways in which they felt that their story was distorted and turned into something cartoonish and, to them, grotesque. What that whole controversy brings up for me is the whole sense of, when you're writing a memoir, whose story is it? You can write about yourself, because you certainly have that right. If you're a parent, do you write about your children, especially if they're having any kind of difficulty, or even if they're not? Do you write intimately about anything in their lives? A lot of parents would know that would be like reading their diaries without permission. So in other words, writers accept at times that there are some limits to the places that they can go to tell stories. But if somebody like, say, Augustin Burroughs happened to live with his family for a while, and then many years later writes about them, the question that the family asked in that article in Vanity Fair is, did he have the right to do that? And my biggest question about that book comes from a review I read of it by a psychiatrist named Jeffrey Geller. I believe that's his name. And I believe he was very active in trying to make things more humane at Northampton State Hospital. And he feels that the portrait of the pater familias in that book, who's known as Dr. Finch, but his real name was Dr. Turcotte, a man who suffered from bipolar disorder, who did some very good things, I've heard, and then obviously some very strange and silly things and maybe even damaging things. But this one psychiatrist has really felt that the book does a disservice to readers who might be thinking of seeking psychiatric help, because this particular portrait of this particular doctor is so distorted, really. What I try to do when I read a memoir is or what I think anybody should do when they read a memoir, or if you're writing one, is eventually try to see things from the other people's point of view. When you're a child and you grow up, you finally matured when you can finally see your parents' lives from their point of view, not just from yours. And I think in a memoir you try to do that. And I'm not sure that Augustin Burroughs, in his memoir, saw that family's existence from their point of view. As a writer, it would have been really interesting had he been able to actually do that. And it might have made for a deeper book. The people who like that book like it because they think it's funny.
I'm curious, back in the classroom, it sounds as though you do a wonderful job of framing and providing some perspective for your students. Have you stayed in touch with any of them over time so that you've had feedback about what they thought of their work looking back in, let's say, 10 years, if that's a reasonable time?
Yeah.
To get more perspective?
I do stay in touch with them. The thing is, I don't know if it's true here, but at UMass, students, because they need to take that huge school and make it small, if they find a teacher they can work with, often they'll come back for more than one class. So often I have relationships with students over the course of their sophomore, junior, or senior year at the school. And if they take the memoir class in particular, that's the one when I run into them in subsequent times that they remember. And they remember everyone in the room and what they wrote, because I fight to keep the class small. But it's a very unique experience from their point of view, having to attend these gen ed classes, which are lecture classes filled with between 300 and 500 students. So I do keep in touch, and with lots of my students, particularly ones who've gone through the memoir. And some of them I urge with all my heart to continue with their work that they started as writers in the classroom, but I also know that they probably have to wait a while. They have to put time on their side. Because what they write for me is almost by the end of the semester, it's basically quote unquote chapter length, but it's really would be a short chapter, and it's almost like the outline of a chapter. So most of them are not getting the whole picture. But they write about wonderful things, including sometimes about anorexia and bulimia. I should say that once the semester progresses, one wonderful student who was a dancer wrote about, how she just didn't eat, basically, in order to survive as a dancer. And one night she fell asleep. She was doing exercises, like put her legs up against the wall with reading a book, and her mother found her like that, fast asleep, just sort of passed out. And she realized it was time to make some changes in her life. But I have a student who wrote about, so many things. Sometimes the students come from privilege, and so their stories are not particularly harrowing, though they can be delightful. A kid who grew up in New York City, whose family had a house in the Berkshires, was an only child, and she felt very trumped by this house when her family finally got this summer home. And so she wrote a piece called Second Place. And it was just funny and life-affirming. Another student who's actually from Whately originally comes from a family where her grandfather invented the zipper. So she wrote about being from a family where their grandfather had invented the zipper, which was actually a lucrative thing to invent. And occasionally, the answer to the question, who invented the zipper, is on that show Jeopardy. So she calls it out if she sees it. But they write about, often about hyphenated identities, being Portuguese American, or one student wrote recently about being an Iranian American, and what that was like for her, what that has been like for her, especially because of recent changes in the global scene. Students have had parents commit suicide. One student had a sister who was murdered by her husband. Students have written about coming out as a gay person, all kinds of different experiences. So that what's really weird is when you enter the room in September or February and you see these fresh young faces, you have no idea what is going on inside their heads and inside their lives. And sometimes that a student writes something, I find this for the class, and it's not the story they meant to write or really want to write, but they could only go so far. And that's something that you can respect very readily, partly because it's built into the classroom experience, as Leo noted, that a lot of the classes run on is interactive, with everybody critiquing each other in a positive way. But it means that if you're not the best writer, you can still come across and get a great grade if you're a great editor and a great reader. So that there are all kinds of ways in which you can do well, not just that you came to class with the best story to tell. That's great, but not everybody has that. A student who actually I think is going to write his book fairly soon, who was an MFA student, but after your time, grew up on Martha's Vineyard, and the lead of his memoir, he now lives in Shelburne Falls, but the lead of his memoir was about at the age of 11 not liking being in his family, which included his mother, who was a lovely woman but ended up being extremely agoraphobic. He had never left the island. in his life. And the one time the family tried to cross over on the ferry to the mainland, his mother didn't get on the boat. So the rest of the family were on the boat, couldn't find her. Great panic ensued. They took the next ferry back, and she had actually just gone back to the house. She could not face leaving the island. So he, of course, could face nothing but leaving the island. And at one point, he tried to join the Marines and sent some letter off to a recruiting agent and got a very nice letter back saying that while he seemed to possess many of the qualities that the U.S. Marine Corps is looking for, including, bravery, et cetera, that the Marine Corps was not yet so desperate that they were recruiting 11-year-olds. And his piece the piece he wrote was called Island Bound. But see, I keep thinking some of these will come out as books, and that will be fun. Yeah. Okay, you and then you. Okay.
What do you do with humor in this course in terms of memoir and your own obvious inclinations with music and narrative, storytelling, speaking?
Thank you. I love reading things that make me smile, even if they're about, terrible things. I mean, that's what I think the greatest, like Life is Beautiful. I thought that was a beautiful movie because it's set against the backdrop of terrible things that had this other sense of humanity. You can't tell people to be funny. It's like if someone says, I don't know, I'm used to work with Dave Barry down at Tropic Magazine at the Miami Herald, and he would walk in the room and people would start laughing. I don't know what his gift was, but I don't have that. My humor is more wry and understated, but I certainly think there's plenty of room for humor in memoir writing. And here's a little example. Tobias Wolff, this is the kind of humor I like. Tobias Wolff, when he was at suffering just terribly, living with his mother and an awful stepfather, also longing to escape, had a copy of his report card from a school system which was foolish enough to put the grades in pencil. And he figured if he changed them and applied to a prep school out east, he might get in. So he looked at his abysmal grades and figured out that if he put all A's, he might have a chance. So all he writes is, "Luckily, I had a pencil." That's the kind of humor that makes me howl with laughter. Up there, yeah.
I was wondering how you view the late Hunter S. Thompson, so-called godfather of gonzo journalism, in the context of memoir.
I think he's partly a fantasy writer. So his memoirs are partly about, as we know, about things that didn't happen but might have happened if they could have happened if the whole world were on hallucinogens. So I think that probably the story of Hunter S. Thompson that would most interest me would be the really well-written biography. His life ended really tragically, which makes him hard as a role model for students, because a lot of students really like his work. And then there's this part of him that was so, self-destructive at the end that it's hard for them to understand how their hero isn't here and why. And I'm not judging him, I'm just saying that still has yet to be really addressed. But I will say that this is also temperamental, and I'm not as much into the hyperbolized, prose that someone like Hunter S. Thompson practices, or Tom Wolfe, or Dave Eggers. I'm much more into the writing of writers like Alice McDermott, who's very chiseled, or Alice Munro. So that's just a temperamental thing. So Thompson never completely spoke to me the way he did to many people, particularly the young guys that I teach. They love him.
One last question.
Blue, okay. I see two. Can we take two, and then I'll do it quickly.
If
I'll
your
make this
story
quick.
is a memoir, but your brother is a public figure, and you spend a majority of your life together to a certain point, like birth 30. When it comes to some of the extended family, can you change the names of the women to protect them? And can you use like real names and not real names?
People do, and they usually make a note of it. But the more you do that, the more of your own thunder you're stealing. But people do that all the time. But when I read that names have been changed, I can live with that. But when I read composite characters, I think that's just fiction. You're trying to use the fuel of nonfiction, the energy that comes because you say something happened and then play around with it, and that actually is unappealing to me. It takes, as I say, it takes away some of my goodwill as a reader. Okay? One last question, I guess, then we'll.
Would you consider Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Confessions autobiography?
I would consider them both. Yeah. Okay, listen, time's a wasting. I hope you all get to write your own works, and thank you for being here. Thank you.